They told me my land wasn't being used, like that alone gave them the right to decide what should happen to it. And I'll be honest, at first I almost believed them, not because they were right, but because they sounded so certain. That's the thing about people who think they're in charge. They don't ask, they assume, and if you stay quiet long enough, they start acting like your silence is permission. I found out something was off in the most ordinary way possible. Just another evening, sun dropping low behind the trees, I was out by the side of the house watering a row of tomato plants I'd been half committed to all summer, when my neighbor Rick leaned over the fence, beer in hand, like he always did around that hour. He nodded toward the back of my property and said, "Hey man, didn't know you sold that strip back there." I laughed, like a reflex more than anything, because I hadn't sold anything, hadn't even talked to anyone, and I told him as much. He shrugged, took a sip, and said, "Huh, could have sworn they were marking it for something." That stuck with me longer than I expected. Next morning, I walked out with my coffee, still half asleep, and that's when I saw them, bright pink survey flags, stuck into the ground in a line so straight, it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. Not scattered, not random, deliberate, confident. Like whoever put them there wasn't guessing. They knew exactly what they were doing, and more importantly, they acted like they had the right to do it. I just stood there for a while, mug in hand, staring at those flags cutting across the back of my land like a quiet little invasion. No noise, no warning, just there. Now the thing about my place, it's not flashy, not the kind of property people drive by and admire. For acres, long and narrow, tucked just outside of Millbrook Ridge, or what used to be outside of it, before the developers showed up and started turning open land into rows of identical houses with matching mailboxes and rules about how tall your grass can be. I bought this land years ago, back when nobody wanted it, too uneven. They said, too wet in the spring, too dry in the summer, not ideal for building unless you were willing to spend more than it was worth. But that was kind of the point for me. I didn't want perfect, I wanted space. I wanted something that didn't come with a handbook. The back portion of the land slopes down into a low field. Every spring it collects water, turns into this shallow, reflective stretch that catches the sky just right. And by midsummer it dries up into cracked earth and wild grass that grows however it wants. I never built on it, never fenced it off, never turned it into anything that would impress a real estate agent. To me, it didn't need fixing. Apparently, that made it a problem. Behind my property now sits this new development. Maple Hollow Estates, neat rows of houses, identical driveways, little decorative trees planted at exact intervals like someone measured them down to the inch. There's an HOA running the whole thing, and from what I'd heard, they took their job seriously, maybe a little too seriously. Lawn too long. You get a notice. Trash can visible from the street. Notice. Wrong color mailbox. I don't know if they fine you or just send someone to stare at you until you feel guilty. And somehow, that mindset didn't stop at their property line. I followed the trail of those pink flags, walking the length of my back field, boots sinking just a little into the soft patches of ground. And it didn't take long to realize this wasn't just some random survey. The line was too clean, too intentional. It ran parallel to the development behind me, cutting about 12 feet into my land, 12 feet, the entire length of it. 12 feet that nobody had asked me about. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe it was irritation, hard to tell the difference sometimes. And I drove into Maple Hollow, parked near their community office, clean little building, glass front, soft music playing inside like you're walking into a spa instead of a place that sends you letters about your grass height. There was a woman at the desk, mid-40s maybe, polite smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and I told her my name, mentioned the property behind the development, and asked, as casually as I could manage, "Do you know anything about survey markers being placed on my land?" She didn't even look surprised. "Oh, yes," she said, like we were talking about a scheduled delivery. "That's part of the Green Corridor plan." Green Corridor. That was the first time I heard it called that, like giving it a nice name made it less of a problem. I asked her what exactly that meant, and she turned her monitor slightly, showed me a layout, walking path, benches every so often, decorative lighting, a little winding trail designed to give the residents something natural to enjoy without ever really leaving their neighborhood. And there it was, clear as day. The path ran right along the back edge of their development and straight through my land. I pointed at the screen, then back at her, and said, "That line, that's my property." She nodded, still smiling, still calm, like this was all already settled in her mind. "It's just the back portion," she said. "You're not really using it." There it was, plain and simple. Not using it. Like that was all it took. I remember letting out a small laugh. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't quite believe how easily she said it. "So, because I'm not doing anything with it, that means someone else can?" She tilted her head just a little, still keeping that polite tone. "It would benefit the entire community. It could even increase your property value." That part almost got me. The way she said it, like she was doing me a favor. I asked her who approved the plan, who gave them the right to map out a path on land they didn't own. She said, "The proposal has been filed with the city." Filed. I remember repeating that word in my head as I walked out. Filed isn't the same as approved, and it sure as hell isn't the same as owned. But I didn't argue. Not there, not yet. Because by then, I had a feeling this wasn't going to be solved with a conversation. And I was starting to realize something else too. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong. In their minds, that strip of land behind their perfect little neighborhood wasn't mine. It was just unused space waiting to be improved. And maybe that's what bothered me the most. Not the flags, not the plan, but the assumption. Like I had to justify why I hadn't turned my land into something that made sense to them. That night, I pulled out my old survey documents, spread them across the kitchen table, ran my finger along the boundary lines I'd seen 100 times before. Everything was exactly where it had always been, clear, documented, undisputed. There was no gray area, just a line, and someone had decided to step over it. I sat there for a long time, staring at those papers, thinking about that word again and used. And somewhere in that quiet, I stopped thinking about how to stop them and started thinking about how to make them regret assuming they could. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, not in the loud, explosive kind of way people expect, but in that quieter way where your mind just keeps turning something over and over, like you're trying to see it from every angle until something clicks. And sometime around 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, it did. They weren't worried about permission, they were operating on perception. In their eyes, that stretch of land wasn't being used, which meant, to them, it wasn't really claimed, not in any way that mattered. So arguing with them, calling lawyers, filing complaints, that would just turn into a long, drawn-out process where they'd keep moving forward while I tried to catch up. No, if I wanted them to stop, I had to change the one thing they were relying on. I had to make that land impossible to ignore. Saturday morning, I drove out to a rental place about 20 minutes away, small operation, nothing fancy. A guy named Curtis running it who looked like he'd been working the same counter for 30 years. He glanced at me over his glasses when I told him what I needed, a tiller, a compact tractor attachment, irrigation supplies if he had them. He raised an eyebrow. "You starting a farm or something?" I shrugged. "Something like that." He gave me a look, the kind where he knew there was more to the story but wasn't going to ask, just nodded and started writing up the paperwork. "Bring it back in one piece," he said, sliding the form across the counter. By mid-morning, I had everything I needed loaded up and headed back, and I didn't waste time. The moment I got home, I drove straight out to the back field, past those bright pink flags that were still standing there like they belonged. I remember stopping for a second, just looking at them again, lined up so neatly, like a quiet little declaration. Then I got to work. The first pass with the tiller was rough. The ground hadn't been touched in years, roots tangled underneath, patches of hard, dry soil fighting back, but that was kind of the point. This wasn't supposed to be easy, it was supposed to be visible. By noon, the field didn't look untouched anymore, it looked alive. Messy, uneven, churned up in places, but undeniably active. I kept going, working in long lines that crossed right through those survey markers, turning their clean, straight path into something broken, interrupted, temporary. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward the houses behind me, a few people standing on their back patios, watching. You can always tell when something doesn't fit into someone's expectations. They don't say anything. They just stand there, arms crossed, trying to figure out what they're looking at. By late afternoon, I started laying irrigation lines. Nothing complicated, just enough to make it clear this wasn't a one-day project. I took my time with it, made sure everything looked intentional, because it was. Sunday, I planted. Not flowers, not anything decorative or neat or HOA friendly. I went with fast-growing crops, the kind that don't care about aesthetics. Corn, squash, a few rows of beans, things that spread, things that get tall and dense, and a little wild if you let them. The kind of plants that, in a few weeks, would turn that open strip of land into something thick and uninviting. Something you don't walk through. And I made sure to plant right along that 12-foot line. Not around it, not beside it, directly on it. By the time I finished, the field looked completely different, not polished, not pretty, but undeniably used. There was no mistaking it anymore. This wasn't empty land. This was active ground. Monday morning, I added the final touch. Signs. I kept them simple, bold lettering, easy to read from a distance. Private agricultural property. No trespassing. And the one I knew would really get their attention. Pesticide application in progress. Now, everything I used was organic, properly documented, nothing harmful. But the wording wasn't about what I was actually doing, it was about how it would be perceived. Perception. That's what started this whole thing. By Tuesday, the email started. I didn't respond right away. I let them sit, unread at first, then skimmed through them later that evening. Polite at first, asking what I was doing, whether this was temporary, whether we could discuss a mutually beneficial solution. By Wednesday, the tone shifted, not aggressive, but tighter, more urgent. That calm confidence from before, it wasn't gone, but it was cracking a little. That afternoon, I saw a man walking along the edge of my property, polo shirt, khakis, clipboard in hand, the unofficial uniform of someone who thinks they represent authority. He stopped right at the boundary, didn't step over. I'll give him that. But he stood there long enough to make sure I noticed. So I walked over. We stood there for a second, just looking at each other. Him glancing past me at the rows of crops, me waiting to see what he'd say first. "Mr. Callahan?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm David Mercer. I represent Maple Hollow Estates." He gestured lightly toward the field. "We've received some concerns about this." I followed his gaze, like I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. About what? He cleared his throat slightly. The agricultural activity. This area was previously mine. I cut in, not raising my voice, just stating it. He paused, just for a second. "Yes, of course. But it was unused." There it was again. Unused. I couldn't help but smile a little. "Doesn't look that way now." His jaw tightened, just enough to notice. "We had a proposed walking path scheduled for this section. It's part of a community improvement plan." "Yeah," I said, glancing down at one of the signs nearby. I saw the flags. He shifted his weight. Those were placed under the assumption that the land was available. I finished for him. "I know." We stood there in silence for a moment. Wind moving through the newly planted rows, leaves just starting to settle into place. He looked back at me. "Is this permanent?" I shrugged. "As long as it needs to be." That answer didn't sit well with him. You could see it in the way his grip tightened on the clipboard. "We may need to involve the city," he said. I nodded, like that was perfectly reasonable. "You should." And that seemed to throw him off more than anything. No resistance, no argument, just agreement. Because by then, I knew something he didn't. I wasn't doing anything wrong. A few days later, the city did reach out, not aggressively, not accusatory, just procedural. A man named Harold Jensen called me, introduced himself as part of zoning and land use, asked if he could come by and take a look. I told him he was welcome anytime. He showed up that Friday morning. Older guy, calm demeanor, the kind of person who's seen enough disputes to know most of them aren't as complicated as people make them. He walked the property with me, asked a few questions, what I was growing, whether I planned to sell, what kind of treatments I was using. I answered everything plainly, no need to dress it up. At one point, he stopped near the edge of the field, looked out over the rows, then back toward the development. "Interesting timing," he said. I smiled. "Yeah, funny how that works." He chuckled, just a little. "Well, from what I can see, you're within your rights. Agricultural use is permitted here. No special permits required unless you're running a large-scale commercial operation, which this isn't." He made a few notes on his clipboard, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And those signs, might want to make sure they're accurate." "They are," I said. "Everything's documented." He nodded. "Then you shouldn't have any issues." And just like that, the one thing Maple Hollow thought they could use against me wasn't going to work. As Harold drove off, I stood there for a while, looking out over the field again, the rows starting to take shape, the soil settling. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. For the first time since I saw those flags, I felt something shift. Not just relief, something closer to certainty. Because now it wasn't just my word against theirs. Now, it was the land itself speaking. And it was saying the one thing they didn't want to hear. This isn't available. After that visit from the city, things went quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. More like the kind you get right before something either falls apart or quietly disappears. And for a few days, I wasn't sure which way it was going to go. I kept working the land like nothing had happened. Early mornings, coffee in hand, walking the rows, checking the irrigation lines, watching the first signs of green push through the soil. There's something grounding about that kind of routine, especially when everything else around you feels like it's shifting. You focus on what's in front of you, what you can actually control, and you let the rest sort itself out. But I could feel them watching. Not in a paranoid way, just presence. People from those houses behind the field would step out onto their patios, linger a little longer than usual, some of them pretending to be busy while their eyes drifted over to the crops. A few times, I caught snippets of conversation carried by the wind, confused, a little annoyed, sometimes even curious. One afternoon, I noticed a woman standing closer than the others, right up near the edge where my property line met their perfectly trimmed grass. She didn't cross it, but she stood there long enough that I figured she wanted to be seen. So I walked over. She looked like she belonged there, clean, composed, the kind of person who probably knew exactly what day the trash got picked up without ever having to check. She gave me a polite smile, but there was tension behind it. "I live in the corner house," she said, gesturing vaguely behind her. "We were told there would be a walking path here." I nodded. "Yeah, I heard about that." She glanced at the field, the rows now growing thicker, leaves starting to spread, turning what used to be open space into something dense and alive. "This makes it difficult." I couldn't help it. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "For walking?" She didn't smile. "For access. For the community." There it was again, community. It always sounds noble when people say it like that. Like whatever they're asking for automatically carries more weight because it's for everyone. I leaned slightly on the fence post, looked out at the land for a second before answering. You ever notice how community usually stops right at someone else's property line, unless there's something they want on the other side of it? That didn't land well. Her expression tightened. We were under the impression this was going to be a shared space. "Yeah," I said quietly. "So was I." For a moment, neither of us said anything, just stood there with that line between us, invisible but very real. Then she nodded, like she'd reached the end of whatever she came to say. "Well, I suppose we'll see how this gets resolved." I watched her walk back toward the row of identical houses, and I remember thinking, this is what it really comes down to. Not just land, but expectations. They built something structured, controlled, predictable, and right up against it sat something they couldn't define. And instead of adjusting to that, they tried to change it. A week later, I woke up early like usual, stepped outside, and for a second, something felt different. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The flags were gone. Every single one of them. No bright pink markers. No straight line cutting through the field. Nothing but rows of crops. Leaves catching the morning light. Moving gently in the breeze like they'd always been there. I walked the length of the property just to be sure. Half expecting to find something else. Some new attempt. Some leftover sign that this wasn't over. But there was nothing. No note. No explanation. No apology. Just absence. And honestly, that told me everything I needed to know. They didn't change their minds because they suddenly respected my ownership. They changed because it stopped being easy. Because the moment that land became something active, something inconvenient, something that required effort to push through, it was no longer worth the assumption. And that's the part that stuck with me. People will take what's simple, what's quiet, what doesn't push back. Not always out of malice. Sometimes just because it's there, and they convince themselves it doesn't matter. Until it does. Over the next few weeks, the field kept growing, tall stalks, wide leaves, patches of green spreading out until that entire stretch looked nothing like it used to. It wasn't neat, it wasn't designed, but it was real. And slowly, the watching stopped. The people in those houses went back to their routines, patios, barbecues, weekend yard work, and that invisible line between us settled back into place. Not friendly, not hostile, just understood. I never heard from the HOA again. No follow-up emails, no revised proposals, nothing. If they changed their plans, they did it quietly, probably rerouted that walking path somewhere that didn't push back, somewhere easier. And I'll admit, there was a part of me that expected to feel more victorious, maybe, like I'd won something. But standing out there one evening, watching the sun drop behind the trees, light stretching across the field in that same way it always had, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like holding on, like drawing a line and deciding it mattered. Because the truth is, I could have ignored those flags. I could have told myself it wasn't a big deal, 12 feet. What does that really change? I could have let them build their path, watch people stroll along the edge of my land like it was always meant to be shared. And maybe life would have gone on just fine, but it wouldn't have been mine in the same way. That's the part people don't always talk about. Ownership isn't just paperwork, it's presence. It's the willingness to stand there, even quietly, and say, this matters, even if you don't understand why. That land didn't need a house on it to have value. It didn't need a fence, or a structure, or a sign explaining its purpose. It just needed someone who was willing to treat it like it wasn't up for discussion. And maybe that's what really changed for me through all of this, not how I saw them, or the development, or even the situation itself. It was how I saw that word, unused. Because now, I don't think there's any such thing. There's only land people haven't bothered to understand yet. So here's what I'm curious about, and I mean this honestly. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you have pushed back, turned that quiet piece of land into something impossible to ignore? Or would you have let it go, let the path be built, told yourself it wasn't worth the fight? There's no easy answer here, and I think that's what makes it interesting. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think, and I'm genuinely curious where people land on this. And if this story made you think a little differently about ownership, boundaries, or even just how quickly assumptions can turn into actions, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and stick around. Because sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that hit the hardest.